What are your honest thoughts on Jordan Peterson and his relationship with religion?
What a fun question to think about. Well, um, a couple summers ago, Jordan tweeted out a very kind thing about my book, and he said that he had rarely read a book where he had learned so much, or about which he knew so, about which he was so much in ignorance or something. It was very complimentary. And then he followed up with another tweet asking about my mathematical challenge to the creative power of mutation and selection, and what did his followers have to say about that. And then that created a spirited Twitter debate. And so for the first time, I composed a 240 word or letter message on Twitter. I'd never done it before, and summarizing the evidence that we have, showing that an accumulation of mutations will degrade the structure of what's called a protein fold long before a new protein structure called a protein fold, a new structure, can arise. And this is a fundamental impediment to the creative power of the evolutionary mechanism. I mentioned this on the Rogan podcast, but I've written about it extensively. Anyway, it showed to me that Jordan Peterson is clearly interested in the big questions. I think he has in his expositions about of the Bible highlighted the psychological wisdom that's present in the biblical stories, particularly in the book of Genesis about the family, the patriarchs, and now he's done the similar thing on Exodus. And so when he's asked directly, well, do you believe? Then he says, well, that would come to say, I do believe, would come with a great responsibility to act in a way that's consistent with that belief. And so I really don't want to answer that question. And he says, it's a question of he wants to say that the proof is in the pudding of how you live, and that people should, I think, essentially make a determination of that by assessing how he lives. But he's been famously kind of ambiguous or cagey in his response. And he gives a reason for so doing, which I can completely respect. I think he's such a fascinating figure because he's clearly a very authentic person who is grappling with the big questions of morality, questions of how we should live. He gives fantastic advice to young people about lifestyle choices, encouraging people to get out of the hookup culture and actually get married and start a family and take on responsibilities. I wrote a piece for the Jerusalem Post in summer of 2022 talking about the passing of Steven Weinberg, one of the great physicists of our generation. And Weinberg was an aggressive scientific atheist. He had no interest at all in religion. He thought it was a waste of time. But in writing the piece, I argued that his passing may well represent a kind of passing of the torch or a waning of the influence of the new atheists. And that instead, the most interesting figures on the scene right now are what I call the new atheists. Figures like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and Niall Ferguson and Douglas Murray and others who in some ways would like something like theism or Christianity to be true because they lament the loss of a Christian or Judeo-Christian foundation for culture, but for one reason or another can't quite get themselves over the line to belief. Now, I had a three-way conversation with Douglas Murray and Tom Holland on the wonderful Peter Robinson hosted program Uncommon Knowledge last fall, and it dropped earlier this year, I think in January, and it's had a lot of views and a lot of interest. It was a fantastic discussion. And I think Douglas Murray is still in that camp of being a sort of new atheist. He has a great respect for Christianity. He wrote one of the most moving reflections on the burning of the cathedral at Notre Dame, but he himself is not a believer. I don't exactly know either where Jordan Peterson is, but I suspect he is a believer at some level. In the case of Tom Holland, I think he's no longer a new atheist. I think he's no longer a Christian atheist. I think he's moving in a decidedly theistic and Christian direction. And so each of these interesting figures, I think, has their own interesting journey and story, and that's what makes them so fascinating. In each case, in none of those cases do you have anything like confirmation bias going on. I mean, Holland's story is fascinating. As an historian, he's fascinated with the ancient pagan empires, Assyria and Greece and Persia and Rome, and then he discovers that something dramatic changes in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, and that whereas the ancient world is abjectly cruel and severe and unforgiving, suddenly you have this concern for widows and orphans and the disenfranchised and hospitals and the sick, and he says, what changed? Well, it was the Sermon on the Mount. It was the Nazarene. It was Christianity is what changed the Western world, and now we're all swimming in that Christian milieu, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. We have Christian ways of thinking that have been part of our culture for centuries. And so, I mean, he's just an absolutely fascinating figure because he comes into the religious question, the God question, from a point of view that had no inclination to be interested in this at all. He discovers it in a sense anew. So I just think it's a really interesting time in the culture that you have figures like that who are all involved in a very authentic journey, search, inquiry, in advancing a very authentic perspective that is something we all should think about. So yeah, I'd love at some point to get a chance to talk with Jordan, because I think he's raised the most interesting questions right in the center of the culture.